between August 15th.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Levy Lecture. My name is Wendy Cromash. I am your host and moderator. And today we have a very special program. We are going to be speaking to Mark Larson about his book, Ensemble. Mark is a retired ETS teacher. Then he taught on the college level. Theater was always his first love, and after he retired from teaching, he decided to write this book about the history of Chicago theater from the 1950s to today. And he spent 4 or 5 years traveling the country, talking to people all over. Over 300 people were interviewed, and the result is a mostly verbatim account of all the different aspects of Chicago theater, how it got started, how, different theaters started. It's fascinating. And I know that you will enjoy listening to his presentation. I want to thank the Levy Senior Center for sponsoring this lecture. Without their support, we couldn't do it. Also, we have generous sponsorship from Evanston. Let me just tell you a little bit about them. Less than a year old, Avador is open on Oak Street in downtown Evanston. It offers maintenance-free living for adults, active adults, 55 plus. It's very upscale. Make sure you stop in for a visit. It's a great option for people who want to downsize without the commitment of buying. Rentals start at only $18.85 per month. They also offer, they have apartments available through community partners for affordable housing. If that is of interest, you should, when you call, ask for Maddie, and you will get additional information. That's MADDIE. They observe all pandemic protection protocols, making it easy for you to tour the building. Make an appointment today and take advantage of special opening pricing and flexible lease timing. They will make it very easy for you to move in. Let me read you the contact information. Go site avadorevanston.com or call 847-802-8700. Thank you, Avador, for your generous sponsorship. We appreciate it tremendously. Okay, that is pretty much my only housekeeping announcement. People who are raising their hand, I don't use that function here. If you need to reach me or you have questions, please use the Q&A function. Once we start, Mark and I will take ourselves off camera and come back to you after the presentation for Q&A. I think that's it. Mark?
Thank you, Wendy.
Welcome to the Levy Lectures.
I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you. I wish we were all in the same room, but this is lovely. I'm an Evanston resident too, and so it's nice to be speaking to a group of neighbors. But man, I wish we could be in the same room.
It would have to be a large room, though.
Yeah. Well, that'd be nice. Yeah. I want to thank you, Wendy. I want to thank Levy for this. I appreciate your setting this all up. Speaking of Evanston, I wanted to mention too, I heard that it's possible that Cookie Gluck is somewhere out there. And if you are listening, Cookie, hello. For people who don't know who Cookie is, she in the 70s was the costume designer for Organic Theater Company here in Chicago. And she designed the famous and infamous costumes for Warp, which was this sci-fi adventure series that they did and actually took to New York. And
they were crocheted, right?
Yes, they were crocheted, famously crocheted. And she got a Drama Desk Award for it. So maybe if you're out there cooking, maybe we'll ask you to tell the story of why they were crocheted and why all the actors' rear ends were exposed. So I might call on you if you're there. I also wanted to say before I start that I wanted to say happy Black History Month. The history of and the influence of Black theater in Chicago is really significant and obviously indispensable to the entirety of the story. And you're going to see examples of that through this talk. But in addition, I don't know if you could see this, but I wanted to recommend this book if you'd like to burrow deeper into that. It's called Black Theater is Black Life by Harvey Young. And it's an oral history too. And I used it a lot as I was researching my own book. So there's that. With that, as Wendy said, I'm going to pull myself off the screen. And the reason is because the premise of my book was always that I wanted the people who made this history to speak for themselves. It's partly why I started in the 50s even, so that I could have access to people. So I'm going to pull myself off. You're going to hear me narrate a little bit. And then I'm going to be playing some clips from the interview. So you'll hear the actual words of the people that are found in the book. All right. Between August 15th, 2019, when my book Ensemble first came out, and early March of the following year, my book talks tended to focus on how Chicago went from being a city with just a handful of theatrical endeavors of its own to an internationally recognized theater town with some 250 homegrown theater companies. And it happened over the course of my lifetime. Now, I understand that you can't really read the names on this list. This is a list that the League of Chicago Theaters sent me of the theaters that were in existence prior to the pandemic. But it does give you an idea, I think, of how many there are here, just the bulk of it. There were 250. And this is a short and hurried list of artists whose careers either were spawned here or were nurtured here. It's a remarkable list, not just because it's long, but when you look at some of the names there. So I'm going to let you just read some of those names. So how did this happen? How did this happen? That was the central question of my book. How did we get, for example, to take one example, how did we get from this, that's Gary Sinise there outside of Steppenwolf Theater in their very first home in the 70s. How did we get from that to this, which was one of their first homes when they moved into the city, to this? And by extension, to this, which is a drawing of their new home, which unfortunately was supposed to open last year, but wasn't able to because of the pandemic, but we're all hoping it will soon. So that's a pretty remarkable trajectory. And I stress again, it's over the course of one lifetime. But as we meet this afternoon, the theaters I wrote about are closed for the moment. The seats are empty and have been empty for almost a year, and they are likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. The world has changed a lot, and we are changing too. Someday I suspect we're going to wake up from our quarantine and find, like Rip Van Winkle, that we have walked into a new era. And I have been wondering what the Chicago theater scene I have been describing will be like when this is over. Will all 250 theaters survive? How will they adapt? And how will this extended pause change them? And how will it change us as an audience? I do sometimes find myself wondering if what I wrote about and have been talking about is now part of a bygone era. It could very well be. But that doesn't have to be such a bad thing either. I talked with Chris Jones, and he told me about an observation a friend of his had made about my book.
Somebody said to me about your book that it's turning out to be an elegy. and I think that's sort of interesting because that's probably true. Something ended, I think. Now, what we don't know at this point is, did it end and then, was it a pause and then it came back and it was the same things we recognized from the past? Or is this just a huge shift? But from a historian's point of view, it's obviously going to be, it's the obvious time to end something or start something.
I think it's both, obviously. This is the playwright Idris Goodwin. And in an interview in the March 20th, 2020 edition of American Theater Magazine, he said this: "This ain't the intermission, it's the show. This is the moment where everything changes. We are in the inciting incident." That's where we are right now. We are in the inciting incident. And I believe he's right. This is the moment before what's next. I now think of my book Ensemble and those by Richard Christensen and Jeffrey Sweet, Chris Jones, Harvey Young, John Mayer, Pete Blatchford. I see those now as the exposition. They're the background for the story to come. I think we are living now in the beginning of the story of how Chicago theater will have survived and returned from a devastating crisis and what it became, not in spite of it, but because of it. This is actor Rashada Dewan in Caroline or Change at Firebrand Theater. We talked last summer during the lockdown, and she made an interesting, and I think poignant observation about this unique moment.
What are you seeing in the arts community happening as a result of this?
I think people are being held accountable in ways that we haven't felt like we could hold people accountable before. That we've had several talks. I mean, I've talked to my elders in the Black theater community, and they have shared with me a lot of things that I did not know. As far as like previous efforts and what the theater business is really about, the business of it is really about broken relationships, all the underlying things that you don't really get until you talk one-on-one with someone. And when I'm learning, and then I've sat and talked with theater directors, executives, board members. And what you'll learn is, again, we all have the same wants and needs. Now, how we go about getting them is how we comb through our own insecurities, which we also all have. And that's what I'm seeing.
Although the people I talk to for this book are more like age peers of mine, many are the elders of the Chicago theater community who played a significant role in its development, like Cookie Gluck, for example. I have also had conversations with theater makers more recently during the lockdown about what that has been like for them and what they foresee might be the future of theater in Chicago. So this afternoon, what I'm going to do is share with you some of those clips, both from the past and from the present, which I sifted through for clues to what might help Chicago theater scene to rebuild after this crisis. Start with this. In 2016, Harmony France and Danny Smith founded the Firebrand Theater that I just mentioned. It's a company dedicated to musical theater works with the mission of empowering women. With a dazzling, they opened the 80-seat space on the first floor of the Den in production of Lizzie. Firebrand, I think, embodies what I think of as Chicago theater spirit. It's about creating your own opportunity. It's about spontaneity, full-out commitment, intimacy, unadorned authenticity, risk-taking, and an activist orientation. Today, Harmony cannot say with any certainty what will happen to her young company, but she does seem confident of one thing.
It's going to survive anywhere with Chicago.
Why do you say that?
Because we create, like you said, we create it out of nothing. We create, no one has a storefront community like we do. We create off no money. So we stay up all night, we sleep at the theater, we paint our own sets when we have to, you know. We're so scrappy, we're so activist based, we're so progressive. We work here, we work at our art. If it's going to survive anywhere, it's going to be here. And it might not be me, it might be this new generation, but it's going to survive.
Well, it's in the DNA.
It's in our, yeah.
Yeah.
We're working class artists. It's so about the work, and it's so about, especially with the newer storefront companies, we all have activist missions, and I don't think that's going to change.
While conducting these interviews, I came to believe that there are unique dispositions that served this community well in the past. And it's also propelled it forward and may be able to propel it beyond where we now stand. I'd like to share with you just a few examples of what seem like genetically inherited dispositions that I think will help Chicago theaters and artists find their way back. The first of them is a disposition that claims if there's no art opportunity available, create your own. This is a photograph of Greg Mosier on the right and the playwright David Mamet. Gregory preceded Bob Falls as artistic director of the Goodman before being invited by then New York City Mayor John Lindsay to run the Lincoln Center Theater. Late last year, he invited me to come to New York to speak to a group of theater students and faculty at Hunter College. And he chose the name of my talk for me. He called it Start Your Own Damn Company. And then it had like a tagline, why wait to get hired when you could start your own company? He told me this is a message that he wanted to share with New York students and faculty. Greg knows that spirit well too. He was an essential part of it in the 70s. That spirit here in Chicago also has a very long history. You can go back to 1905, when Robert Motz founded the first Black-owned musical and vaudeville house in the US called the Pekin Theater. That's a picture of it there. It would also serve as a training ground and showcase for Black theater talent. This is a shot of the interior I thought you'd like to see. That's on stage. In 1940, playwright and poet Langston Hughes formed an early theater company in Chicago that he called the Skyloft Players on the South Side. When that disbanded, the Center Aisle Players formed, and they opened in a space at the YMCA at 38th and Wabash. And that was followed by others that you're going to hear about in just a moment. But the story I wanted to tell in Ensemble begins 13 years later in 1953. And I did that for practical and logistical reasons. Practical because I wanted the book to be told exclusively in the first person. And many of the pioneers of that time are still with us and were more than willing to talk. And logistical because that's the year I believe that disparate efforts inspired by what had preceded them began to get traction as a movement. This is when it grew from what one director, new to Chicago in the 1960s, called a theater desert into what it is today. To give you an idea of how Chicago and Chicago theater in particular was regarded in 1953, here's what one prominent New York journalist wrote. A.J. Liebling visited Chicago and wrote about us in a series of articles for the New Yorker magazine. Here's just a taste of what he had to say. It is not considered smart to admit having seen any play in Chicago because this implies either A, that you haven't seen the real play, or B, that you haven't the airplane fare to New York. He later collected those essays into a book he called The Second City. Even 30 years later, this point of view by non-Chicagoans was prevalent. Here's another example of what I was talking about. This is Nicholas Ruddle. He was a founding director at Court Theater. And he had transformed the Court Theater from a summer theater, which is literally in a courtyard at the University of Chicago, into the company that we know today. He shared with me an incident that occurred in the late 70s. Claire Bloom came to Chicago and made an appearance at the University of Chicago.
I remember that a friend of Philip Roth managed to get Claire Bloom to come here to perform scenes of women in Shakespeare in Mandel Hall, and the place was packed. The number of seats was notorious. It was 1066, and there were 1066 people in there. And I won't say his name because he's dead now and he was a friend of mine, but he introduced Claire Bloom as coming into this desert of theater. The place fucking exploded in boos because it was, and she was devastated, but he was a writer. But it was already there, in other words.
Yeah.
That was...
But only Chicago knew it at that time.
That's right, because it was something like, it's before 1980. So it's in the mid to late 70s that this happened. So I've always remembered that the people in the theater booed when the introducer of Claire Bloom was gracefully greeting her into this desert of theater. And everyone knew it's not that, it's different.
That really marks it in time too in our history, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That we knew it, but the world didn't know
No.
it yet. There was that moment.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to 1953 now. The same year that A.J. Liebling published his condescending essays, a young director named Paul Sills and another gentleman named David Shepard, undaunted by the fact that the University of Chicago, which Paul attended, had no theater department, created their own damn company at the university, and they called it the Playwrights Theater Club in 1953. That little company, though it would last less than 2 years, spawned some remarkable talents, including Barbara Harris, Mike Nichols and Elaine May, Joyce and Byrne Piven, and Ed Asner. They first performed on the 3rd floor of Mandel Hall at the University of Chicago, and then they later moved to the 2nd floor of what had been a Chinese restaurant, making it one of Chicago's earliest storefront theaters. As I said, Playwrights only lasted 2 years, if that, but it did produce an ambitious schedule of some 22 productions of classic works. When it disbanded, some of the players regrouped as the nation's first improvisational theater called the Compass Players. And when that disbanded, Bernie Solins and Paul Sills and Howard Alk, who is not pictured here, opened a small cabaret that they named, with gratitude to A.J. Liebling, the Second City, in 1959. And Chicago has had the last laugh ever since. On the south side of Chicago, meanwhile, Black theater was expanding too, and it grew to include some 10 Black theater companies in the 1970s, which Harvey Young wrote about in his oral history that I mentioned earlier, Black Theater is Black Life. These companies, like Playwrights Theater Club did, opened as a way to create opportunity where there had been none before, but for a different reason.
Keep in mind that most of the Black theaters that were created between the 1950s and, say, 1967 were created because we were not allowed to participate. Okoro Harold Johnson, I think, was the first Black director who was allowed to direct a play at Theater on the Lake. He was the very first one. You had all these actors who weren't able to find work. They were restricted by being in these environments. So they created theater companies so that they would have a way to express themselves. By the time I came along, it wasn't as important. We started creating for the purpose of serving our communities. It wasn't about being excluded. It was about creating art that would uplift the lives of our folks.
And then in 1974, Jeff Perry, Terry Kinney, and Gary Sinise co-founded the Steppenwolf Theater in a space that they carved into a church basement in Highland Park that seated 88. Here's that picture again of Gary with their first sign. And I had an interview with him, and I asked him about what was the driving force behind with their work and what it was they were trying to accomplish. And listen to what Gary has to say about this that connects with creating your own opportunities.
You used the phrase "get a theater started." What was your concept then? Were you thinking in terms of an ensemble, or were you thinking just of putting on plays? What was the notion then?
Well, I think we were thinking of an alternative to what you would normally consider doing once you left college as an actor. What are your options? Well, you know, people go to Hollywood or people go to New York. And at that time in the mid 70s, you know, there weren't a lot of theaters in Chicago, not a lot going on. And, you know, I think we were just looking for an alternative to going to New York or Los Angeles or something like that. We were looking to create a company of actors that had control over our own work. And we were all willing to sacrifice trying to make a living doing that work for controlling our own work. So that, you know, we would get jobs, and everybody had different day jobs, and we could pick our own plays, we could pick our own parts, we could determine who was directing and who was acting, and we were kind of had our creative control, which is what everybody was more interested in than going off and auditioning for a lot of things and all of that. We were willing to kind of just do our plays and work our day jobs.
That sounds like a real motivating factor then, this idea of having control over your own options and your own work.
Yeah. And, you know, maybe for some people it was just fear of the unknown, you know. Well, at least I know I can go up and live in a basement and do some plays, and rather than just going off to the big city of Hollywood and New York and trying to, you know, make it on my own. I'll go up to Highland Park and work in a basement, and at least I'll get to pick my own parts.
We wanted to create an alternative and have creative control. I've heard so many variations on that same theme as I talked to these people who had been there at the beginning and who are still there. Several months into the lockdown, I spoke with Paimon Rami again, along with theater artist and cultural leader Maseko Myers, about Chicago after the quarantine. You should be able to detect this same notion of self-direction and motivation, which they predict will be important to the future of Chicago theater.
Yeah, you know, artists fall into a number of different categories. You have those artists that wait for someone to give them an opportunity. Then you have the artists that create opportunities. And then you have those artists that have been forced into a position to become administrators or landlords, even though sometimes they had no intention of doing that. The people that will survive this, I think, will be the people that are not waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They're going to be those artists that create in a new way.
So is it possible that this impulse, this disposition to create one's own opportunities is so firmly ingrained in the DNA of the theater community that they'll be able to draw on it when they return? I really would like to think so. This is Goodman Theater's artistic director, Bob Falls, back in 1983. He's directing William Peterson in a play called In the Belly of the Beast. And it was in a tiny theater on Howard Street called Wisdom Bridge. I talked to Bob again during the lockdown, and this is him looking back on those days and what might be able to help us move forward.
Well, I've always been, perhaps like you, a bit romantic about Chicago theater. So many of us were born out of absolutely ridiculous circumstances, with no money, very little support. at the time I started at Wisdom Bridge, the Mayor Daley was adamantly opposed to small theater companies, which he found threatening. But yet, bit by bit, we grew, and that happened in the early 70s and mid 70s, and certainly after that, many, many more, hundreds of theaters grew from virtually nothing.
This is an ethos that says we're all in this together, and our responsibility is to the whole group. This is actor Alan Arkin, who's had a career that began here in Chicago and really took off when he joined the very first Second City cast in 1960. In 1960, his career was going nowhere when Paul Sills invited him to come to Chicago and join the company of his newly formed Second City after two original members had left. And I asked Alan about those days in Chicago, and this was his response. And I found this really interesting, a half a century later, and given the extraordinary career he's had since then. Here's Alan.
One of the things I think about periodically, I think a lot of me maybe it would have been smarter had I stayed in Chicago, because exactly what you're talking about, there was a sense of us against the world, a sense of a family that was really genuine with when I was in Second City. And I've looked for that my entire career and found it maybe 6 or 8 times, but not nearly as much as I could have had I stayed there.
Back when I could sit in a movie and then watch it like 2 and 3 times because they wouldn't kick you out. Russians Are Coming is one of those that I just kept watching. There's something.
Yeah, well, the Russians Are Coming was an extension of Second City in a way, because Norman Jewison had a brilliant and very embracing philosophy of film. That everybody, it was a community project. We were all doing it for the same reason. It had enormously important social significance for us, for all of us, and so that had that had very much a sense of community that you're talking about that comes out of Chicago. And about a half a dozen movies over the years have had that sense of, but not terribly much more than that.
Now, this is Laurie Metcalf, and with her there is Billy Peterson on the right, and behind her is Gary Sinise. This is in Balmain Gilead. She was an original member of the Steppenwolf Theater Company, and she first performed with them in that Highland Park basement. So she was very much a part of all of this coming together. And she too told me about what she felt made the company so successful, and and by extension, what makes this community so successful, the ensemble spirit. And this is how she describes it.
Were you using the term ensemble early on?
I think we did. I think very early on, we just called ourselves Steppenwolf Theater Ensemble, maybe. I think we used it. If we didn't use it formally, it was always in our heads that what we did was as a group. Nobody thought, I'm going to use this as a platform for myself, you know?
Really?
Mm-mm.
It was really all about the group then.
It was about the work. It was about, it was about how are we going to make this the best thing possible. It was collaborative from the beginning. We wanted to make an impression not individually but as a group, and so maybe we knew we had energy, we had passion, we had a shared sense of humor. And we wanted to, we wanted the group to succeed.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
This is a phrase that gets me every time I hear it. Think of the significance of that. We wanted the group to succeed. Move it beyond just in the arts. Think of this moment that we all share, the pandemic, a fierce and unseemly election, and a fraught transition, the Black Lives Matter movement, and a long overdue reckoning with racial inequity, the ongoing struggle for LGBTQ rights, climate change. We wanted the group to succeed. The reason I call my book Ensemble is because that disposition that we were just exploring, which says we want the group to succeed, expands beyond individual ensemble companies to a desire for the entire theater scene to succeed. It's the firm belief that rising tides really do raise all boats. This is Derek Sanders, who co-founded Congo Square Theater in 1999. He told me this story that exemplifies and typifies this ethos. And I want you to know this. I heard countless examples that are similar to this.
Let me tell you a story. Can I tell you a real quick story about that?
Yes, do.
So we were doing Joe Turner's Come and Gone, right? That we did it with the Goodman in co-production with the Goodman. At the time we are in rehearsal, my executive director comes to me and says, we run out of money before we even hit tech. Like this is maybe a week or so before we hit tech, right? And he said, I don't know how we're going to finish the set. I don't know how we're going to get this up. Then out of the blue, Amy Morton calls me and says, hey, Derek, can you come down to Steppenwolf? I'm in rehearsal, but I would love for you to, I need to talk to you. And I love Amy. I love Amy Morton, right? And if Amy calls me, I'm going to come, you know? And I said, sure, Amy, I'll come down there and meet you. Sure. So I go down there. Amy comes down, say, hey, Derek, you know, I was a part of a theater company called Remains. And we had always talked about, you know, getting back together, and we just never did, but we kept our account open. And he was like, and we're looking around at the Chicago landscape, and companies we felt like symbolized the work that we did. And she handed me a check and said, we want you to have a piece of Remains. Right? I almost cried. I have a piece of Remains. Right? I almost cried. That sent us over the top. I think it was like $10,000 or something like that. And that was just enough to get us through tech and to get us through one of our more amazing productions of our company's history, right? That to me symbolizes what Chicago community is really about. Yeah. To me, it's one of those things where a company like Remains can reach back to a company of color that they didn't know. They didn't even know they would know, you know? And she didn't know we needed it desperately. She didn't know any of that. And it was just one of those things that I'm deeply proud of. You know, it's just one of those moments that I go, that's why I'm at Chicago. That's why I did Chicago Theater, you know, because of stuff like this.
This is Tony Award-winning director David Cromer, who started in Chicago directing and acting in storefronts and a variety of other Chicago theaters before directing off-Broadway and on Broadway. He received a Tony for A Band's Visit a couple of years ago. And there he is getting his Tony. There's The Band's Visit. And he also received a Tony nomination for directing The Sound Inside last year. He is now a New Yorker, and he offered me an interesting perspective on how and why Chicago is willing and able to take risks, which I'm identifying as a disposition here. So this point of view is born of his insider status, both in Chicago and in New York.
There's always a lot of New York versus Chicago posturing in Chicago because there's really only one model for a theater city, or there's a couple. I guess there's London and in the English-speaking world, London and New York. I was on a panel once, and it turned into the way these panels often do, which is defensiveness about Chicago versus New York and a little bit of New York bashing. And Gary Griffin piped up and said something really wonderful that I quote all the time. He said, I don't want this to turn into a bunch of New York bashing because New York's great. I love New York. New York's sexy and it's exciting. The difference is Chicago does not have a for-profit. We don't have a for-profit model. We have some, but not much. It's mostly a not-for-profit model. Once it's a not-for-profit model, failure is okay. Risk is okay. It's okay to share. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You're not playing king of the hill. There's not only one spot.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of spots. So automatically the values of let's try this, see what it is. And New York is a for-profit model, and there's an enormous amount of money at stake, and space is limited in every conceivable sense. That articulated to me what I'd always felt and never thought about, which was, you could try and fail. You were not going to be destroyed by failing, which just meant there was more later, that if you're willing to think that it all doesn't have to be right now, that there was more later, you could keep trying.
And think of the value of that to artistic enterprises. You have to be able to keep trying. And what Cromer is saying there, and again, I heard various variations on this. In Chicago, you could do that. Bernie Solins, who I pointed out earlier was co-founder of Second City, wrote a lovely memoir. And in the memoir, he said this: Chicago is the risk capital of the world, a blessed city where you have a right to fail. When I talked to Amy Morton, we were sitting at her dining room table, and she said something to me that I flagged the moment that she said it, because I knew this would be a really appropriate epigraph for my book. She said, in Chicago, we weren't going to get rich and we weren't going to get famous, so we just got good. Chicago is home. I don't suppose that's really a disposition, unless it's the inclination to think of Chicago as home, and for that to carry a lot of weight for you, because it's true here. Chicago is home to a lot of these folks. It's their starting place, and there's a lot of loyalty to it too. And I think a perfect example of that is the actor Michael Shannon. This is just a tiny sample of some of the movies he's made. There's Man of Steel, Boardwalk Empire, that was actually on HBO, Shape of Water, Revolutionary Road, for which he received an Academy Award nomination, The Current War with Benedict Cumberbatch, Elvis and Nixon with Kevin Spacey. And at the bottom left there, that's him with Audra McDonald in Frankie and Johnny, which he did on Broadway fairly recently with her. This was the marquee for that show on Broadway. And this is the marquee when he did a show called Victims of Duty at his home theater, a Red Orchid, which is about an 88-seat theater near Second City, actually, in Old Town. It was directed by Shira Piven, whose picture is on the left there up at the top, whose parents were members of Paul Sills Playwrights Theater Club in the very beginning. And on the far right is Guy Van Swearingen. These three and some others did this play a long time ago together with Shira directing. And at the time, nobody knew who any of them were. And so in 2018, the three of them regrouped and mounted the production again at the same place, the Red Orchid Theater, which hasn't changed much in all that time. Michael told me that when they did it the first time, there were sometimes more people in the show than in the audience. I was in the Red Orchid office the day that tickets went on sale at noon for the 2018 production, and I saw the entire run begin to sell out. Tickets were gone within a day and a half. I interviewed Michael and Guy and Shira in a small office on the second floor before a dress rehearsal of that show. And interestingly, in that office, there was this photograph. That's Michael on the right and Guy on the left when they were much younger. And as we talked, Michael would look from time to time at that photograph. So I asked him what he thought about when he looked at the young man he was.
You know, a lot of times I think I don't even know what it is. And yet I know that it's probably, you know, we have a lot in common, I guess. But my life was so different back then. There's so much that, I mean, everybody, you know, 20 years goes by, everybody has a lot of stuff happen, but I mean, I had a lot of stuff happen.
Yeah.
But I think I'm a intrinsically very nostalgic person. I'm kind of riddled with nostalgia. I think I find it comforting somehow. I guess without it, life just seems too chaotic, too random. Because I mean, it is that I was not a person that was on the fast track to success, really. I mean, I was like a barely functional person, and I found this devotion that is in and of itself, as we were saying earlier, somewhat elusive and bizarre, but I was devoted to it no matter what. And then all this other crazy stuff happened. But yeah, it just seemed, in a strange way, I feel safe here somehow.
Here?
Yeah. This is like my den, you know. Helps me remember who I am, you know.
Yeah.
To that point, this photo was taken of Michael at the Old Town Ale House, which is just around the corner from Red Orchid on North Avenue. Michael is watching the 2018 Academy Awards. It's a film in which he played the villain called The Shape of Water, and it was up for a number of Oscars, including Best Picture. Michael is here in the Old Town Ale House because he had directed a play at Red Orchid by his friend Brett Neveu. And it was closing, and this was closing night. He wanted to be here. Chris Jones saw the photograph, and he wrote this about it. I don't recall ever seeing a picture that so vividly expresses acting in Chicago and refusing to let Hollywood change you. I want to turn our attention exclusively to the present now with several recent interviews with Chicago theater leaders. And I'm going to step back and just let these run back to back and let them speak for themselves.
We didn't know what was going on for quite a while. We were optimistic, and then finally realized that we were not going to be putting this production on in the late spring. So we let it go and fully postponed it until next spring. So a year postponement on that. But I think that sent me into a place of sort of reset and reflection and realizing that I personally could not just throw myself into the work as if I'm going to solve everything. I'm going to ride in on the horses. I'm going to join people riding in with flags. We're all going to make this work. No, I think there's too much to absorb, both culturally and personally. And for a minute, I really want to talk about personally, just a sense of sitting and reflecting and experiencing grief, loss, change, and sitting with the unknown and having to recognize that no matter what it is I may want, I have no control over it whatsoever. And just that was good.
Worries me the most, Mark, is returning to a normal, returning to what we used to do. I really hope that after living through this pandemic, that we address the seriousness of inadequacies as it relates to our society, and that there's some serious discussion and action and implementation of new ideas to level the playing field. or make the playing fields more equal. And that worries me the most, that people keep saying that let's get back to normal, but I don't think we want to get back to normal. I think we want to get back to a new normal that addresses some serious concerns about how we live and treat each other.
We want to get to a
better new.
We cannot go backwards. We have to incorporate these lessons that each of us individually and as a group are learning. I just said this to someone last night. This is the room that we're in. Let's learn how to live in it better. Let's learn how to make the theater better from this moment on.
Are you doing well?
I'm feeling fantastic. I mean, although I understand that there are things being shaken up all over the place, the uncertainty is at levels that I've never known us to experience in the arts community. But I can just feel the creativity working, the meetings going, the hard conversations being had. I just feel like we are going to come out of this thing better than ever before.
What is it that's giving you that sense?
Well, because the fact that the whole world has stopped and everything seems to be like a perfect storm of things coming together. How do you just stop, not just the nation, the world, the whole world has stopped for us to have a conversation, and it's brilliant because what it's doing it's strengthening us to talk out and speak out in ways that I don't think this generation has ever had the gall to do. And that is powerful.
I think we have we already were making the weirdest, best new plays, and the audience that we have is sensational. They know what they like and they're excited about it. So I think that the level of thirst is there. I don't think that's gone away at all. We don't necessarily need tourists to make this whole system work. There are people within our city limits that are really excited about the work that's going on here. I also think since we have a lot of storefront spaces, we have a lot of people who are who have strong ingenuity with making spaces work when they shouldn't. I know a lot of back in the days when I was starting, there's a group of people where if we go into space for a wedding or space for a bar, we're like, how many seats can we fit here? Da, 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 da. Now with social distancing, I do that too when I'm walking around. I'm like, you could go here and here and here and here. So we're good at it. I think that will lend itself to thinking really smart about health and how we fit an audience in a place that maybe what didn't used to be a theater. We are big fans of making space out of things that weren't theater spaces. So that's what excites me. And it's a scary time. I feel weird thinking optimistically, openly. But I know that we have such a strong will. And we see theater as an essential service that just needs to be on pause right now so we can figure it out better.
I have a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues in New York City where I think this has struck them much harder. Not to take away from anybody who has suffered. And I think there's been a lot of suffering. And as we said, there will continue to be suffering just simply around employment, if nothing else. But, you know, the New Yorkers I've talked to there's a sense of devastation that they're experiencing. And again, I think the culture of New York City artistically is different. I mean, we've talked about that, just the way theater was created from its ensemble nature as opposed to New York. And my heart goes out to them. And it's very painful to hear and watch and look at. And maybe it is a Midwestern optimism. Maybe it is coming from Chicago, where we've seen the theater community grow from virtually nothing in a short time, very short time, that I have found my colleagues a bit more optimistic and a bit more approaching all of this with a sense of hope, which I think is the way one sort of has to. And we will meet maybe harder truths as they come, with the resourcefulness and the resilience that we have as artists and as a community.
I don't know what it will be like. I think I had this experience. I went to an outdoor show in London, and I felt what it was like to be with other people again at a show. I went to see Jesus Christ Superstar in Regent's Park, and I cried through most of it. It was so moving. I think there'll be a lot of that reaction. People will appreciate, you'll go to the Drury Lane Oak Brook and you'll see some big old musical that you were like, oh my God, here we are again before. And now you'll be, what a miracle that all these people have come together and done this show and everyone's okay and we're all still alive, hopefully. And it will be appreciated. It won't just be part of the wallpaper of the city anymore because it was gone.
Is there a way you feel like the community over romanticizes itself?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the reverential sense of community, the reverential sense of we may not have the money, but boy, we got love,
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's how you keep a community together too. It's like any community's self-definition. Some of it's true and some of it isn't. But enough of it is true so that it has meaning.
Yeah.
And I think it still has meaning.
I'll close with this. This is Sana Seleman. She is a newly appointed executive director of Boho Theater. She's all of 24 years old. And in a recent conversation with her, I was heartened to hear that the dispositions that I've been speaking about are still in place.
One thing I am always learning is that I have more to learn. And so I started reading your book a couple hours ago. There is so much that I don't know that I'm eager to learn about, but being able to understand that you're not always going to be perfect, you're going to make mistakes, but yeah, if we don't try, where are you going to end up? So that is so interesting. This idea, it's this balance between the art is precious and then to also try something new. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but that's, you've learned. And so it's not a failure. It's just you learning that, okay, well then we're not going to do this. It didn't work, didn't resonate with our audience, didn't resonate with us, so be it. That doesn't mean that it's a failure, what comes out of that, what space does that open up for someone else? What legacy does that have? I think, just trying to dive in and take a breath and just kind of do it.
If the story I tried to tell in Ensemble of how the Chicago theater movement began small and grew into a vital, internationally recognized theater town is any indication, I think there is every reason to hope that it will return. Not to what it once was, though, but as Paimon Maseko said, to a new and better normal. I thank you so much. Thank you, Wendy, and I'd be happy to take any questions now, if you'd like.
There, perfect. Thank you. Well, that was fascinating in every way. Okay, so let me go through some of the questions, and then I have some questions as well. Do you believe that Chicago theater is less competitive than Broadway?
Yes, I think that's what David Cromer was saying. And, he's speaking from the point of view of having both experiences. It does tend to be less competitive, partly because, as he said, everything is just so expensive there. And if you rent some space, or even if it's a really small space, if the thing crashes and burns, that's really going to be damaging to you. Here in Chicago, so everybody's competing both for that space and the time and the audience and all of that. Here in Chicago, the sense I kept getting was that rising tides really do raise all boats. If it's good for the community, it's also going to be good for my company. And that's an ethos that I saw over and over and over again. We'd like to help you out. What do you need? That kind of thing. The question is, what's it going to be like after all of this when we find our way back? You know, are they going to be fighting for the same audiences? You know, what's going to be happening there? I don't know. But to this point, I think it's fair to say Chicago is not as competitive.
Did the availability of affordable grassroots rents and storefronts, odd spaces make these theaters possible?
Yes, absolutely. That's another disposition I sometimes use in the talks, which is real estate is relatively cheaper here, and you could find a little corner and put on a show. You know, there was something called the Voltaire Cafe where a lot of people first started. You know, because they could do things there or in the back of a bar, that kind of thing. That's part of the spirit of Chicago. Where can we find a space and put on a show? And so there is that availability.
Okay. Let's see. Do you think as theaters become more successful, like Steppenwolf or Shakespeare, does the bottom line and public success become more important for them?
That's a really good question. And I think the answer is inevitably so. Inevitably. And that's something, you know, people who start off, you know, just in the scrappy way, that's a hard thing to swallow. Jeff Perry, who is one of the founders of Steppenwolf Theater and has been the star of Scandal until it just ended their series. He told me about a time that they had been extremely successful. They were preparing to take a show called Grapes of Wrath, directed by Frank Galati, to New York. And they were rehearsing it in this tiny little space across the street from their Steppenwolf space. So everything, I mean, things had been really growing and growing and growing. And now they were back to using a small space to rehearse in. And he said, we were using a broom for a gun. We were using this little chair as a car. And he said, I couldn't help longing for those days again, you know? And Rondi Reed talked about, she was one of the very early ensemble members, sitting in that beautiful space they have there on Halstead and looking around. And she just said, I can't believe this is what we did. But sometimes I really wish we could go back to coffee can lights, you know, and just a one set and that kind of thing. So there is that longing, but inevitably it's the bottom line.
Right. That question, by the way, was from Jacqueline Grossman. Thank you, Jacqueline. What about the audience for theater in Chicago? Don't you think the part of the story of the creation of the audience is for the work the theater does?
Yes, absolutely. It's there. I see them as part of the ensemble, and I hope that part comes out in the book too. There's examples in there. I can think of one right off the bat. One is Steep Theater, a small theater, which sadly has just lost their space during this lockdown. But they're a wonderful theater and very small. It does a lot of really inventive work. And Kate, who is the managing director there, told me a story about how this had just recently happened when we were talking, but somebody came to the box office and said, I want to buy a subscription for next year. And she said, oh yeah, you had a subscription last year, right? And they said, yeah, we didn't like anything. We didn't like anything that you did. And she said, well, why are you doing this? And he said, because we like you and we want to see what you're going to do next. I think that's not a one-off. I think that's a spirit that is kind of embedded here. I think audiences are willing to take risks with these artists. And the other thing is, I think they like watching them grow up. We all watched Laurie Metcalf, you know, become what she is. John Malkovich. You know, yes, that's a really good question, and I think it's really true.
Okay. Are you aware of any playwrights writing about the pandemic now?
I am not. Some of them I've asked some people, and they're a little coy about it. Yeah, and I don't want to I don't want to speak for them. All right. So I'm just being really general here, but I have talked to people who are trying to figure out two things. One is how this needs to be addressed, you know, and how is this going to be addressed? But when's going to be a good time to address it? And when we all come back from this, are we going to want to live in a tiny apartment set, you know, about the pandemic? You know, when will be the right time for it? How will it be filtered in? I think it's going to be a really interesting question. But I do know some that are, but they're not speaking about it yet.
Okay. I know the Piven workshop was extremely influential on drama and actors here. Are there other cutting edge drama teachers in the Chicago area? And can you talk a little bit about the Piven workshop and the influence they had?
Yeah, it's another Evanston institution. That started in the 70s too. And actually, let me put this into perspective. The Piven Theater Workshop is in that grade school, the Noise Cultural Center, as you all know, which had been a grade school. It was in the Noise Cultural Center that Tracy Letts and Dexter Bullard first hired an 18-year-old Michael Shannon to be in an early Tracy Letts play that nobody was wanting to do called Killer Joe. But the Piven workshop has always been in that space, in that room. I mean, in that building too. And I just recently talked to Joyce. I interviewed her for something else. Joyce Piven, who's the co-founder with her husband. They go all the way back to the work of Viola Smollett and Paul Sills and the people who were, you know, like the beginning of improvisation, American improvisation, and utilizing theater games in the rehearsal process and that kind of thing. And I sat in the Piven Theater Workshop and watched Joyce directing and working with some very young people. And I thought, do you kids have any idea how close to the source you are when you're listening to Joyce Piven? She was right there at the beginning of this movement. She's right here with you now. And she was teaching the same kinds of things. And you're right, it's very influential and continues too. It's still going on. And some wonderful people have come out of that too. So the Cusacks for three.
Right. I'm just going to read section from your book that talks about these games. I found it very moving. You're talking about this woman, Viola, which you can elaborate on afterwards. But so Viola's work emerged out of Neva Boyd's and Jane Addams' ideals. In fact, some of Viola's games actually embody Jane Addams' philosophies and ideal. It's quite remarkable, for example, that Jane Addams said that a cultivated person, meaning an educated person, but she used the word cultivated, is one who can see through the eyes of another. And when I'm teaching, that's what people tell me happens when they play Viola's game, Mirror, that they are seeing through someone else's eyes. Other games like Give and Take embody the ensemble nature that's the spirit of what Viola's work really is. So Viola's games are almost like the direct embodiment of Jane Addams' ideals of social ethics. That quote is from Aretha Sills.
Yeah, Aretha is Paul Sills' daughter and Viola Smollen's granddaughter. When you read that too, it kind of gave me goosebumps. I haven't seen it in a while. And it makes me think of something Joyce said. She said, if somebody asked me, how do we fix the world? How do we change the world? I'd tell them one workshop at a time. And that can sound really glib until you know the thought behind it. You know, what you were just reading about, how this, you know, working with other people and relying on the other people and they're relying on you. There's another game called Machine that captures this really beautifully, where one person starts an action and they're part of a machine and then somebody else joins them and it's sort of connected, but you can't think about it in advance. You just join, right? And you keep adding people and they're all just out of the peripheral awareness are picking up on what the others are doing. And Joyce said the most beautiful thing is is when they can all slowly, without any cue, end at the same moment. And I think that is a gorgeous thought, that can happen among a group, that they're communicating in a different way. This slow down, slow down, slow down, stop.
Speaking of workshops, there's another quote I want to read about David Mamet. And I just found this, the whole beginning of the book talks about the atmosphere and the energy surrounding the University of Chicago and how things really got started. And it's just so interesting to see these people at the very beginning of their careers. And you feel like they're all in the same room talking to one another, even though it's separate conversations. So one of the early, this quote is from Bill Macy, and he's talking about when he was just getting started as a young kid. At Goddard College, where there were no rules, he came in. This is David Mamet. He was a teacher. He came in, he said, okay, rule number 1, be on time. If you're not on time, I'm going to lock the door. Don't knock, don't disturb us. If you're late a couple of times in a row, don't ever come back. He said, be prepared. What that means is if you're not off book, reading without the script, don't ever come back. Completely off book, I'm going to make you sit down. He said, don't ask stupid questions. I don't want to hear your stupid student questions. Keep your mouth shut until you have a good question. And they worshiped him. They were absolutely spellbound by his command and command of the material and what they were teaching him. It was just exciting to read.
May I say something more about that?
Absolutely.
William H. Macy talked about how he had been in school in Vermont and been a student of Mamet's, and that's what you were talking about there. He and Stephen Schachter, who became a director, were kind of traveling together. They went to New York, and then they went to LA, and they're trying to make it, right? And Mamet had, at the Organic Theater, had a play called Sexual Perversity in Chicago, which was just kind of stitched together pieces. And Mamet, it was not a huge critical success. It got some attention. Mamet, according to Macy, this is what Macy told me, Mamet called them in LA and said, come to Chicago, I've got a big hit. And I want to start a theater company here. Come to Chicago. And Macy said, and we did. We got in the car. I don't even know how we did all this, but we got in the car and came to Chicago. And my response was, you mean just on the power of David Mamet? And he said, yeah, he has more power than that. There was a real charisma there. But they started the St. Nicholas Theater, which just itself is short-lived, but did some wonderful things.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, we're getting a lot of questions about very specific small theaters. And I just want our listeners to understand that there are over 250 theaters mentioned in the book. And we don't have time to talk about all of them. Jack is asking about the Immediate Theater in Evanston. Robert is asking about the Black Ensemble Theater. Let me keep going down the Writers Theater up in Glencoe, Apple Tree Theater, Light Opera Works. There are many.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, we don't have hours to sit here and talk about every single theater in Chicago and all the stars. I mean, but the book is a fascinating read about a lot of these topics.
You're right. I can't address them all. I do want to clarify, though, there aren't 250 in the book itself. as the League of Chicago Theater counts them, that's how many are in Chicago or were
Okay.
before the pandemic. And I didn't cover them all, which brings up the very painful matter that I had to deal with constantly is what's in and what's not. And that was as large as the book is, I always say almost everything isn't in it. It's just not it.
Okay, I misspoke, but
No, that's
the
all right.
book is over 700 pages, and it does cover a lot of material. So,
Thank you.
but of course, it can't cover everything. You talked about there's a section in the book about the influence of Fred Kaz. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Fred Kaz was the musical director at Second City and a much beloved person. He was kind of a character though too. But he was not the first. A guy named Bill Matthew was the first one. He was an accompanist as a teenager at the Compass Players, and then he became the first musical director at Second City, with Barbara Harris and Alan Arkin and those guys. After him came Fred Kaz, who had a really wonderful reputation as a jazz musician. And Paul Sills said, what you do with jazz is what I do in the theater, in improvisation. He became the musical director, and he stayed for a long time. When I talked to cast members who had worked with him, they talked about him as he was like part of the cast, because there's this, they're improvising on the stage, but Fred was improvising on the side too. And in a lot of subtle ways, the cast members in the book talk about it, how he would guide them even, but it was a give and take thing, and a beautiful, beautiful relationship. And Fred sadly died just a few years ago.
Yeah, the chapter in the book about him was very moving. You talk about the woman who was very instrumental in Steppenwolf. Help me out. Pardon me?
Martha Levy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. There's a whole chapter on Grease. I had no idea that the show Grease started here.
Yeah, it started at the Kingston Mines, and which is a converted trolley barn that they turned into a theater. And Jim Jacobs and Warren Casey had this idea, and took it to Kingston Mines, and they said, "Yeah, let's try it." It was really different than what ended up on Broadway. And Jim Jacobs in the book, he's one of my favorite characters in the book, although I have many. But Jim Jacobs, who wrote it, talks about that whole process from the moment they got the idea straight through it to its going to Broadway, and what that was like. And it happened fast too. It happened really fast.
Yeah, there's just you conveyed very descriptively the energy and the atmosphere in the city in the 50s and 60s, especially around the University of Chicago, and how that continued in the 60s and 70s, when a lot of the ones who are still around, still performing, they just were brave. They took chances. They weren't worried about commercial success, or how much they were being paid, or they weren't materialistic. They just wanted to get the art out.
Yeah.
And it was so genuine. You just brought that out so consistently, and through your questions of the people that you interviewed, and many of them were wistful, talking about and these are very successful people, wealthy, with great careers, but like Alan Arkin talked about Chicago as one of his favorite places, and they have fond memories, and a lot of them got their confidence here in Chicago, which enabled them to do other things.
That's, Laurie Metcalf even said one of the things that really helped them when Steppenwolf was starting was they were down in that little basement in Highland Park. Almost nobody came to see it. It was family and friends. They could do whatever they wanted. And they played all sorts of different roles and tried different things. And in that time where they were basically on their own, they were able to become this mighty ensemble. I know I tend to over romanticize things anyway, but so that's why I end the book with something near the end of the book, with something Tony Adler, another Evanston resident, said. He was the theater critic for The Reader for many years and during this evolutionary time. But I asked Tony if the theater community here overly romanticizes itself. And he laughed and he said, yes, of course. But he has a great line. He said, but some of it's true. Some of that stuff you talk about, some of it's true and some of it's not. But enough of it's true that it holds the community together. And I really like that notion.
Speaking of Evanston, can you talk about Northwestern's theater program?
Oh my, yeah.
And how, I don't know whether it influences Chicago theater or if it's just like a feeding, source of actors and technicians, but can you talk about that, please?
Interestingly, I was a guest at David Catlin, who is a co-founder of Looking Glass Theater. He has an acting class at Northwestern, and he had me, come and talk like this to his acting students. These are senior level students. And I got really choked up because David, the kids are on the kids, they're seniors in college, but the students
but they're still kids.
Yeah, they're still kids. They're on the screen, you can see them. And David talked about each one of their projects to me. He told me about the projects they did and what made each one exceptional. And that's the generous heart of David, for one thing. But what got me really choked up was I remembered David Downs, who was David Catlin's professor, at the time that Looking Glass became an ensemble with David Schwimmer and David Catlin and Andy White, Evanston. When that group came together on the Northwestern campus, right? And David Downs was a very significant person in that way, in terms of helping them do this. And David Downs told me about projects of his students. And I said to the students, David Downs told me about David Catlin's projects, and David Catlin is now telling me about your project. And that is really special. I love that. And I remember Frank Galati, who taught there too, talking about the Martha Levy's project, Martha Levy's project in the same way. So this continuity is really cool that I really like. Go ahead.
No, go, please.
Another group that came out of Northwestern, and they sort of came together there, is called Practical Theater Company. It's this little group, it's part improvisation and part just these wonderfully, not esoteric, but just eccentric sketch work. And they all had this unique sense of humor that they shared. And some of the people that came out of that were Julia Louis-Dreyfus and her husband, Brad Hall. And so they created the Practical Theater Company. They performed at the corner of Howard and Custer. It used to be a shoe shop. And that was their tiny little theater. I don't even know what it seated, but it was pretty small. And they grandly called it the John Lennon Auditorium. That's their sense of humor. They were invited to perform in a space adjacent to Second City called Second City ETC. They performed there. Tim Kazurinsky, Evanston resident, who was on SNL at the time and a writer at SNL at the time, told Dick Ebersol, the producer, you need to go see the Practical Theater Company. He went to Chicago for other things, but he went to Chicago, he saw the practicals, and I promise you, this is in the book too, Ebersol asked 4 of them to join the cast of Saturday Night Live that night and to come the following week. everything changed for all of them.
Right.
Albert came from Northwestern.
And Julia Louis-Dreyfus discusses in the book how it was not the same warm, creative, it's okay to take risk atmosphere in New York. And she was not happy at all. She did not do well. She talks about that very candidly, that there were just, they went from being able to do whatever they want and make their own decisions into a very almost corporate environment. And it was shocking and not really what they wanted.
And what she says, though, is thank God I had that experience in Chicago, because I was able to carry that with me. And what's fascinating, I don't know how many people who are with us watch Veep, but that is a fascinating show to watch in terms of an ensemble, the way they all work together. And I talked to a number of the cast members who all said that's coming from Julia, for one thing, but a lot of them come from Chicago. Kevin Dunn, Julia herself, Gary Cole from the Remains Theater, a whole number of Dave Pasquesi. All these people come from Chicago.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because David Schwimmer became famous on Friends, which is a great ensemble cast.
Yeah, they carry that with them. I think.
Yes, they do. Hang on one second. Okay, we're at the 2:30 mark. We have lots of other questions, but we're not going to be able to get to them, unfortunately. Mark, this was so much fun.
It's good to be with you, and I do again appreciate your patience with the tech stuff.
Well, the audience, they know I've had my tech issues, so I empathize and sympathize, but it was not a big deal. It was just such a lovely afternoon to hear you talk about these people and the history of Chicago theater and how important it is to the city and to these actors. So thank you so much. Before we leave, I wanted to, I know you're working on another book that I hope you'll come back and talk to us about.
Yeah.
Why don't you just mention that, please?
In a nutshell, it's also an oral history, but I'm calling it a composite portrait. While working on Ensemble, I got to know Ed Asner, which was a great privilege for me. Spent time at his home, interviewing him there. And when Ensemble was done, I got really fascinated by this man and said, hey, what would you think of my doing this oral biography? And he said, yeah, let's do it. I mean, it was that quick. And so I was supposed to fly out there and spend some time with him, but of course that happened, everything. But we've been having a lot of Zoom calls. So I have these recorded Zoom calls with Ed. So that's coming up. So thank you.
That'll be great. We will look forward to that. I'm trying to remember. I know he was in something recently where he played a patient in a nursing home.
Yes. The one with Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin. Gracie and Frank.
Yes.
Or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Right. He was in a nursing home. That's right. And he screwed up their internet somehow.
But he also helped a woman get away from her nasty boyfriend. I mean, it was a great role for him. And he just seems like such a benchy guy. You just want to hug him.
He's a great guy. And he's 91 years old now. And he's continuing to work. He's Dead to Me, Blue Bloods. He takes a show on the road. So that's Ed.
The scene I'm talking about might have been in Dead to Me. It might have been in Dead to Me, but regardless, he was great in it.
Well, he died in Dead to Me. He was also in a nursing home.
So maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Anyway, he was wonderful. This was really fun.
I really
and the audience loved it as well. I am looking forward to you publishing the Ed Asner book and coming back. And if he's still around, we can have him too.
Yeah, he'd do it.
Okay, great. That would be fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lou.
Sorry about my dog. It's a perfect time to end.
She waited till the very last minute, so.
He did. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amador
you very much.
Evanston. Next week, and next week for Valentine's Day, Patty Lynn will be here with The Belle of Amherst, an impersonation, a play about Emily Dickinson, and she's fabulous. So please join us, and I promise the dog will be muted. All right. Have a great
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
everyone. Thank you so much, Mark.
Great to be here.
Bye-bye.